He grew up in silence, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he physically couldn't say it. No speech, no words, not even a sound. While other kids called for their parents, he just stared, wishing his eyes could speak. People thought he wasn't listening, that he didn't understand, that there wasn't much going on inside, but he was listening to everything. And inside his mind, 1,000 unspoken thoughts waited like birds behind glass, beating their wings. So one day he did the impossible. He built something the world had never seen, an app that could speak his thoughts out loud, a voice crafted by code shaped by will, built from a lifetime of silence. And when it was finally ready, after years of trying, failing, learning, he didn't say hello, he didn't say thank you, he didn't say look what I did. He said one word he'd never been able to speak, one name he'd waited 23 years to say: Dad. And in that moment, a silence that had lasted a lifetime finally broke. Eli Carter was born into a world of sound, but none of it belonged to him. No coos, no cries, not even the startled gasp of a baby finding his breath. His mother noticed first, the way his body tensed but no sound came out, the way his eyes followed everything, but his lips remained still. At just a few months old, Eli was diagnosed with spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy. His muscles misfired, his limbs stiffened, his tongue never quite obeyed the commands his brain gave it. And just like that, the world decided what he could and couldn't be. Doctors talked around him: nonverbal, severely limited, low functioning. But Eli wasn't any of those things. Inside, his mind was sharp. He memorized books his mother read aloud, understood every word of the conversations that tiptoed through his room. He had thoughts, big ones, weird ones, funny ones, philosophical ones. But he couldn't share them, not with his classmates, not with his teachers, not with the people who loved him most. At school, he was underestimated. They placed him in special ed programs meant to babysit, not to challenge. Other students avoided eye contact, some out of pity, some out of fear, and some because they simply didn't know what to say to someone who couldn't answer back. He was tested again and again. Each time the questions were too simple. Each time he scored below expectations. Because the tests weren't built for someone like him. They weren't testing his intelligence. They were testing his ability to speak. At home, things were gentler, but still not easy. His mom, Maria, never gave up. She fought for therapy, for assistive devices, for teachers who saw him not as silence. She read to him every night, even when he couldn't say a word back. She'd ask, "Did you like that part?" And he'd blink once, yes, twice, no. It was slow, but it was something. His dad, Brian, was different. A quiet man, a provider. But the silence between them grew thick over the years, heavy, unspoken, like they were both waiting for a bridge to appear, and neither knew how to build it. And yet, Eli never gave up hope that one day he wouldn't just blink to say yes or no. He'd be able to say, "I'm here. I get it. I have something to say too." Because what no one understood was this: Eli wasn't voiceless. He was just unheard. And every day that passed in silence only sharpened his desire to break it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been locked behind the same invisible wall. When Eli turned 16, his school gave him a tablet loaded with basic assistive software, a voice generator. You tap a picture, it speaks a word. It was meant to help. But to Eli, it was another box, The software was clunky, slow, filled with childish cartoon icons. The voice that came out was cold, mechanical, a sterile monotone that sounded like it belonged to no one. It mispronounced words. It lagged behind his thoughts. It wasn't him. To others, it was a breakthrough. To Eli, it was a muzzle made of good intentions. So he began to wonder, what if the software could be smarter? What if it could learn him, his humor, his sarcasm, his rhythm? He couldn't speak, but he could think. And when a teacher introduced him to a basic coding platform, something clicked. He didn't need voice, he needed logic, structure, the language behind the language. He started with HTML tutorials, navigated entirely with a gaze tracking tool that followed his eye movements. Each line of code took 10 times longer than it would for someone with full mobility. But he was patient, relentless, unshakable. At night, while the house slept, he'd lie in bed, screen mounted above him, eyes dancing across letters and syntax like brushstrokes. He learned JavaScript, then Python, then natural language processing. He wasn't just building a tool, he was designing a voice that could express who he really was, a voice that could ask follow-up questions, that could adapt in real time, that could insert a pause for dramatic effect. Because yes, Eli had timing. It wasn't just about function, it was about identity. The generic voices didn't laugh at the right times, didn't emphasize the words he cared about, didn't understand how to feel. So he created a profile just for himself, fine-tuned intonation, layered in inflection, adjusted pacing based on emotional cues. He even programmed a look command, so if someone turned away mid-conversation, his app would pause, then say, "Let me know when you're really listening." Because Eli had waited his whole life to be heard. He wasn't about to be ignored. It took him over 3 years, not because he was slow, but because the world had never imagined that someone like him would demand that much precision. Line by line, he gave birth to a voice that didn't exist in any database. And the moment he finished, he didn't announce it, he didn't post, he didn't call for celebration. He simply saved the file, closed his eyes, and whispered, if only in his heart, "Now I speak." He didn't tell anyone it was ready. Not his therapist, not his teachers, not even his mom, the one who had fought every battle by his side, because this moment wasn't for the world. It was for one person, the one who had always stood just a little too far away. His father. It was a Saturday, late morning, sunlight spilled through the living room blinds in quiet stripes. His dad, Brian, sat on the couch, reading the same baseball magazine he read every weekend. He flipped the pages slowly, his brow furrowed like always, half listening to the hum of the TV, half lost in a world Eli had never been invited into. Eli rolled into the room without a sound. His chair whirred softly over the hardwood. The tablet rested in his lap, screen lit, cursor blinking. He had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in his head. How it would feel, how it might land, whether it would even matter. He stared at the word on the screen. 4 letters, 1 syllable. It didn't need punctuation, it didn't need context, it just needed courage. He selected it, pressed speak. And then, for the first time in his life, the room filled with the sound that was his. Not borrowed, not imagined, his. The app said, "Dad." The word cut through the room like light through a closed door. His father froze. The magazine slipped from his hands. He turned his head slowly, almost like he was afraid he'd imagined it. Eli met his eyes, not blinking, not flinching. The silence between them, the one that had stretched for 23 years, shattered in that instant. Brian's lips parted, but no sound came out, only tears, slow, reluctant, real. He crossed the room in 2 uncertain steps, knelt beside Eli's chair, and whispered, "You called me." Eli tapped again. His voice responded, "I always wanted to." That single word, Dad, carried everything Eli had never been able to say. "I know who you are. I've watched you. I've needed you. I still do." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a question. It was a bridge, built from silence, strengthened by love, and delivered through the power of his own creation. From that day on, their relationship changed. Not instantly, not perfectly, but something sacred had been unlocked. They began to talk about baseball, about books, about nothing. And for the first time in his life, Eli wasn't just a presence in the room. He was a voice in the conversation, because when he said Dad, he didn't just speak, he was heard. After Dad, everything began to shift. Eli didn't just have a voice, he used it boldly, tenderly, curiously. The boy who had once sat through dinners in silence was now the one asking, "Can you pass the mashed potatoes?" And then adding, "Actually, yours are a little dry tonight." His family burst out laughing, not because the joke was perfect, but because the moment was. Eli wasn't just participating, he was present, and with every new phrase, he rewrote the story of who he was. He told his mom, "You're my favorite voice." She cried so hard she dropped a dish. He told his younger sister, Layla, "I missed you more than the sun misses summer." She hugged him tighter than she ever had as a child. He teased his dad about his tragic fantasy football picks. They started keeping score, and for the first time, his father didn't just look at him, he looked to him. Every shared glance now had language wrapped around it. No more guessing, no more assumptions, just clarity, connection, conversation. But what stunned everyone the most wasn't just what Eli said. It was how much he had been waiting to say it. The thoughts came tumbling out, layered, nuanced, funny. He asked Layla if she ever resented how much attention he got. He told his mom he sometimes felt like a burden, and then paused the app before adding, "But I see how much you love me anyway." And to his dad, he said something simple, something no one expected. "Thank you for not leaving." There were awkward moments too. His voice still had its glitches. Sometimes it stuttered, or lagged, or mispronounced something important, but Eli would just raise an eyebrow and say, "That's software, not a stutter." And everyone laughed, because his humor was fluent, even when his speech wasn't. As the weeks passed, his parents began to speak with him differently. They paused more, listened longer, waited for his thoughts to catch up with the moment. They learned that silence wasn't absence, it was patience, it was process, it was him. And Eli learned in turn that his voice didn't need to sound like everyone else's. It just needed to sound like his. And now that it did, there was no going back. Eli could have stopped there. He had built what he needed, a voice that understood him, that finally let him exist in full color. But Eli had spent his entire life being left out. And now that he'd found a way in, he couldn't just close the door behind him. So he went back to his code, line by line, refining it, cleaning it, making it easier to use, easier to personalize, easier to share. Then, without fanfare, he launched it, a free app, with one mission: give people a voice that feels like their own. It started small, a few families in online support groups, a few special education teachers, a few therapists testing it with nonverbal kids. And then something remarkable happened. A mother recorded her daughter saying, "Hi, Mommy," for the first time. Her knees buckled when she heard it. She wrote to Eli, "I never thought I'd hear her call me by name. You gave me something I didn't know I needed." A boy named Jordan, age 10, used the app to tell his dad he wanted to play catch. His dad broke down, not because of the message, but because of the possibility. Soon stories poured in from everywhere. A teen used the app to confess his first crush. A grandmother recovering from a stroke used it to say grace at the dinner table. A young girl with Rett syndrome used it to sing the first line of her favorite lullaby. And always, always, they weren't just speaking, they were being heard. Eli called it VOCA, short for vocabulary of the soul. It wasn't just text to speech, it was speech to self. Every voice could be adjusted: pitch, tone, accent. Users could upload recordings of family members and blend their speech patterns into the voice model. So when someone said, "I love you," it didn't sound like a robot. It sounded like them, human, warm, real. Voca spread across continents, translated into 14 languages, used in refugee camps, stroke wards, classrooms, and care homes. And always at the center, Eli. Not as a tech genius, not as a symbol, just as a guy who knew what it felt like to be full of things no one could hear, and who wanted no one else to feel that alone again. Every week he received messages, photos, voice notes created with his app. But one in particular stayed with him. It was from a boy in Poland, 9 years old, nonverbal. He had used Voca to say, "Will you still be my friend, even if I never sound normal?" Eli didn't respond with words. He sent back a voice file, his own voice via Voca, saying, "You already sound like you, and that's more than enough." Sometimes people asked Eli, "Why was your first word Dad?" He always paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it still felt sacred. Then gently, his app would speak. "Because I wanted him to know. I was always listening." That sentence, simple as it was, stopped people cold. Because how many moments do we assume someone isn't paying attention just because they can't respond? How many silences do we misread as emptiness? Eli's life proved the opposite. Silence can be full, and presence doesn't always make a sound. Now, when he speaks, people don't just listen, they lean in. He mentors young disabled coders, many of whom were told, "This isn't for you." He guest lectures at universities, not about overcoming adversity, but about human-centered design and why every product that assumes a user can speak is missing the point. He consults with tech firms on accessibility, often the only person in the room who knows what it feels like to be excluded from a conversation that's happening inches away. And he reminds them again and again, access isn't extra, it's everything. His dad comes to every talk now, sits in the front row, listens like it's the first time he's ever heard his son speak, because in some ways, it still is. And afterward, when the room is quiet and the applause fades, he helps Eli pack up. He doesn't say much, just a glance, a nod, a quiet hand resting on his son's shoulder, and Eli smiles, because even now so much passes between them that words could never contain. Eli never set out to become a leader, or a developer, or a symbol of anything. He just wanted to say a word to the person who sat in the same room but always felt out of reach. And from that one word, "Dad," an entire world of voices opened, not just for him, but for thousands, maybe one day, millions, all because he refused to accept that silence was the end of the story. Eli didn't just build an app, he built a bridge, one that stretched from isolation to identity, from silence to soul. Eli's story isn't just about a boy who couldn't speak, it's about everything he was saying, long before the words ever reached us. He reminded us that a voice isn't just sound, it's presence, it's identity, it's the right to be part of the world, on your terms. And sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones we've ignored the longest. Because how many people around us are still waiting to be heard, not because they're silent, but because we haven't learned how to listen. Eli didn't ask the world for a microphone. He built one, letter by letter, late at night, with tired eyes and quiet fire. And when he finally had the chance to speak, he didn't choose anger or explanation or applause. He chose one word, Dad, a word of connection, of longing, of love, and through that word he gave permission to every other person trapped in a silence not of their making, to rise, to reach, to be heard. If Eli's story moved you, let it move someone else. Share this video with someone who's always listened, even when you had no words. Subscribe for more stories like this, true feeling, fictionalized but rooted in what makes us all human. And in the comments, tell us the one word you'd say first, if the whole world finally stopped to listen.